Welcome to people in the room and welcome to friends at home. My name is Shannon Brennan, and it's been my pleasure to work with the presenters whom you'll hear today and those whom you heard yesterday as well, as they've been developing their research projects. I want to say again a warm thank you to all of the friends and family members and upbeat acquaintances and downbeat acquaintances who were down nevertheless in a supportive way, who have been there for each of these scholars through this journey, because it is one that requires courage and motivation, and you are the source of those things. So thank you for supplying that. So we have a fun night ahead of us. If you'd like to program, there are many there in that little corner, and that is a true fact. And there are also treats, and they are outside. If you run out of treats, I will invite you to grab yourself some treats, like in the breaks between our panels. So the way the evening will proceed is I'll begin by introducing one of our esteemed professors, who will then invite presenters to the stage. We have 3 panels, each of which has 3 presenters. Those presenters will each read to you. I will invite you after each presenter's work to show them your support in as noisy a way as feels appropriate to you, +1. And then after those 3 talks, we'll have a period of time where you're welcome to ask questions, and everyone is invited to ask questions, and so please do that. Yes. So to introduce our first panel, I will invite you to welcome to the stage Professor Allison Thesis.
Professor Brennan. I would like to invite the first panel to take your places. This panel is titled, How Different Power Structures Affect the Lives of Diverse 20th Century Characters. Presenting tonight will be Anna Lesko, paper titled The Heteronormativity in the Perception of Disabilities in The Sun Also Rises. Kara R. Oldham, Rewriting the Divine, Faith, Freedom, and Female Empowerment in the Color Purple. And Jacob Serletsky, That Spectacular, Spectacle and Despotism in Jessica Hagedorn's Dog Eaters.
Englishman, any foreigner was an Englishman, have given more than your life. What a speech. So says the doctor to Jake Barnes, the narrator of The Sun Also Rises. He is speaking of his impetus. The first words spoken to him were not words of encouragement or compliments for his bravery, but comparing the loss of his biological reproduction to losing his life. How does the inability to reproduce biologically inhibit one's ability to participate in society, gender, and the expressions of sexuality? The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, puts us into the world of Jake Barnes. The novel takes place in the 1920s, following World War I, and focuses on the main character, Jake, who is impotent due to the war and now navigates life post-war alongside his friends, who cannot understand his struggles in adapting to a disability. I claim that while it may seem that Jake's impotence speaks to the isolation of disabled veterans, closer analysis reveals that his disability is seen as less socially acceptable compared to other veterans because this disability affects how his sexuality is seen in relation to his manhood. I argue that society is frightened by people with disabilities because they see them as fragmented, and someone is fragmented cannot create something whole. Jake's disability is thus seen as a failure of his manhood due to his fragmentation, which does not allow him to reproduce. And this biological failure results in his isolation. I claim that Brett's fear of being in a relationship with Jake stems from the fear that those who are fragmented will corrupt those around him. and that she will then suffer the social isolation that society imposes on those who do not conform to the norm. Scholars Puckett and Eliot both discuss Jake's isolation from masculinity and the ways in which he is excluded from the inner workings of performing masculinity in the same way as his friends. Puckett argues that Jake is not a part of the sexual selection battle in masculinity, and goes into the importance that was placed on sexual selection for the purpose of mate selection and the performance of masculinity. Eliot claims that Jake is performing gender in a queer way, relating him to performing gender similar to homosexual men, while Puckett is talking about the performance of males in sexual selection and judging masculinity. In relation to Eliot's argument, we can look at the count. Although he has war wounds, he is a primary candidate for Brett's marriage partner, as she places more importance on status than her appearance in society. Eliot mentions the queerness that comes with Jake's disability. Therefore, in looking at Eliot's argument, we can see how his disability is creating not only non-normative options for her and Jake's relationship, which in turn goes against her belief in relationships as status. Puckett delves further into Brett's role in the competition for mate choice and how her sexuality influences the masculinity that the other men are portraying, but also mentions the Count and how he serves as a good example of a strong mate. I build on these scholars by claiming that Jake's disability demasculizes him through his desexualization due to his inability to compete in the sexual selection and perform his gender biologically. Davis argues that the fear of disabled bodies is the fear of fragmentation, which he defines as a human body that is not whole, in comparison to the norm, that is, a non-disabled body. In The Sun Also Rises, we see this fear repeated when Brett refuses a committed relationship with Jake, and Jake's friends find it uncomfortable to bring up his disability in conversation. He, quote, "He had been going splendidly, but he stopped. I was afraid he thought he had hurt me with that crack about being impotent. I wanted to start him again." In a conversation between Jake and Bill, impotence is at the center of the joke. Jake's friends approach the subject carefully, worried that joking about his impotence would be too far, as they themselves cannot understand his experiences and cannot distinguish what is uncomfortable for them from what is uncomfortable for him. There is not much comfort around the subject of disability, as the fragmentation of one's body causes unease in those who are viewed as whole. The concept of a fragmented body and what that might bring into Jake's body that is viewed as the norm from the outside, but then becomes fragmented once we learn of what the dirty war had done to his body, stripping him of the one thing that matters most in manhood. The piece also helps to argue how those who do not fit the norm by conforming to society's expectations are then excluded from society. Society establishes norms, but they are nothing more than cultural standards, as they are not a natural state of being. We look at the construction of normalcy itself instead of simply the disabled body, in order to get a better look at how disability fits into the world that society deems acceptable. When we look at the text in this lens, we can get a better understanding of how Jake is ostracized in little ways, mostly by Brett, and his exclusion of activities that are seen as the norm, and how that would have hurt him more as a man in the 1920s, keeping up with the society's expectations in a dire time post-World War I. Furthermore, life post-war brings about the need to reproduce due to how many lives were lost in the war in order to rebuild the population. The masculinity of a man then relies mostly on the ability to reproduce. We can see an example of this importance in the text when Jake is recovering in the hospital after being wounded at the war and speaking to the doctor who is treating him. "You, a foreigner, an Englishman," any foreigner was an Englishman, "have given more than your life. What a speech." The doctor at the hospital where he received his care after being injured in the war had acknowledged the severity of his war wound, as the impotence affects him in more ways socially due to the importance of reproduction and sexual performance as a man. We can observe a significant aspect of how Jake's social stigma affects his relationships by examining his complex relationship with Brett. Brett and Jake's relationship is one of the main focuses in the novel, as we ponder whether they will ever end up together, only to find that the relationship remains unchanged from the beginning. The back and forth of their relationship can be seen in the novel's approach to disability and sexuality, looking at how relationships with people with disabilities are not fully completed due to the complexities of sexuality that society throws at people with disabilities. The relationship is close to that of lovers, but Brett fears committing to Jake because of her need for sexual intimacy that is heteronormative. Quote, "Don't touch me," she said. "Please don't touch me. What's the matter? I can't stand it. Oh, Brett. You must know. I can't stand it, that's all. Oh, darling, please understand. Don't you love me?" "Love you? I simply turn all to jelly when you touch me." Brett admits that she feels love and admiration for Jake, but that does not mean she is willing to engage in non-normative expressions of affection, and she rejects him for going any further than small acts of endearment. We can understand the possibilities of her fear more deeply by looking at Davis and how people with disabilities are viewed as fragmented and not the norm. As Davis mentions the impact of Frankenstein versus the Venus de Milo, Frankenstein shows the desexualization of disabilities, while Venus de Milo shows the sexualization. He explains the process of making Frankenstein and mate and the failure of completing the request. Quote, thus the risk of the erotic touch, of the frankly erotic agenda for the creature, is seen as a contaminating danger to normal people. The example of Frankenstein explains one of the aspects of desexualization in people with disabilities, showing the fear that comes with someone who is fragmented, contaminating those in society who are deemed the norm. The desexualization of people with disabilities shows the fear that people have of the sexuality of people with disabilities, going so far as to view it as contaminating. Brett, who places importance on status, does not want to be seen as contaminated in the eyes of others. And so she continues to reject Jake and look towards men who have established their status as others. The stigma that is put on Jake due to his disability is a direct result of the expectations of society that are put on people to perform their gender in the biological way to continue reproduction, which society in the 1920s views as the bare minimum. Jake's disability, although invisible on the outside to strangers, affects his day-to-day life as he lives with the shame of not being the norm in society due to the war and finds himself as an outsider even with other veterans. The function of his disability attacks the medical, social, and physical aspects of his life to work all together and keep him from completing his expectations of gender. He is kept from the woman he loves due to her importance and social status, isolated from his gender, and isolated from his friendships because of the location of disability. All of the impacts of Jake's disability that he experiences asexualize him because he cannot physically perform the biological expectations of his sex, therefore isolating him from other veterans who have wounds in other areas that can still hold the status of a biological man.
You better not never tell nobody but God. It'd kill your mammy. So begins Alice Walker's revolutionary novel, The Color Purple, a work of realistic fiction that centers on the narrative of a young African-American girl, Celie, living in rural Georgia during the Great Depression. This paper provides an abridgment of a larger work and will demonstrate that Celie's perception of God is influenced by a male-female binary that dictates men as dominant and therefore akin to God. In my thesis, I will argue that Celie's perception of God throughout the novel shifts to a divine figure that exists outside this binary. And in doing so, Celie frees herself from the constraints of patriarchy and the isolation that this power structure imposes upon her throughout her early life. The text that follows will demonstrate Celie's initial perception of God as a male figure and explore the transformative relationship between Celie and Chuck Avery, aiming to provide a clear statement of the stakes of Celie's transformation of faith. The epigraph of Alice Walker's The Color Purple, "You better not never tell nobody but God, it'd kill your mammy," are not just the first words of the novel, but function as a justification of Celie's belief in her own isolation. This isolation is influenced by the belief that within a patriarchal world where men are dominant, Celie's womanhood makes her an outsider with no power. Though not explicitly stated, we can reasonably assume that these words were told to Celie by her stepfather after he began raping her. Celie, still 14 years old, gives birth to her stepfather's baby and is promptly separated from the newborn, further isolating her. As her mother lies dying and Celie is pregnant for a second time, she relates in a letter to God how her mother asked her about the paternity of her first child. "She asked me about the first one. Whose it is? I say God's. I don't know no other man, or what else to say." I suggest it's Celie's internalized isolation that prevents her from telling her mother about her stepfather's transgressions and pushes her to claim God as the father of her child. This quote marks the first instance in the text where we know Celie understands God to be a man, and not just a man, but the proclaimed father of her children. At this point in the text, Celie's perception of her stepfather is shaped by patriarchal notions that regard the father of a household as supreme in power and authority. I argue that the only distinction that Celie makes between her stepfather and God is their distance from her. exemplified by Seeley's contact with God through letters, rather than physical space. Therefore, Seeley feels comfortable confessing to and physically safer with God because she believes that he is physically distant and unable to perpetuate violence against her. In order to effectively understand how Seeley's perception of the divine evolves and transforms throughout the novel, the audience must first follow her through her childhood and young adulthood, during which she experiences events and relationships that shape her understanding of self. I claim that the most transformative relationship that Seeley experiences is her relationship with Shug Avery. Shug Avery serves as a powerful example of an African American woman living outside the oppressive patriarchal family structure that has characterized Seeley's entire life. When Seeley hears her stepfather and stepmother talking about Shug Avery coming to town, Seeley asks what it is. Seeley's question foreshadows the arrival of a woman who is different from any woman Seeley has ever known, right down to her unique name, which Seeley first thinks of as an it rather than a person. It will come to signify how Shug teaches Seeley to think of God. And in my thesis, I claim that thinking of God as an it rather than a person is what allows Seeley to shift her understanding from a God that is reflected in people like her stepfather, who is heavily influenced by oppressive power structures, to a holistic view of the divine that exists free from oppression. When Seeley's stepmother gives her a picture of Shug, Seeley describes her as the most beautiful woman I ever saw. She more pretty than my mama. She about 10,000 times more prettier than me. While this quote demonstrates Seeley's preoccupation with Shug's beauty, Seeley soon realizes that Shug's life as a blues singer is unconventional for a woman and makes her the subject of scorn by many. Seeley continues to be drawn to Shug in a way that she can't describe, and I argue that Seeley's subjection to a patriarchal power system, which allows men to dictate what women can and can't do, translates into an adoration for Shug, who actively defies these rules. Seeley places the photograph of Shug Avery underneath her pillow, and Shug becomes a model of the woman Seeley wishes she could be. And now when I dream of Shug Avery. She be dressed to kill, whirling and laughing. When Seeley is older and living with her new husband, Shug Avery comes to stay with them while she is ill. Seeley is immediately intimidated by Shug, who is brash despite being utterly helpless due to her illness. Seeley describes Shug as evil and hateful, but cares for her out of an adoration and a love that she can't adequately describe. This is important because by characterizing Shug as evil, I argue that Seeley is participating in a binary created by the patriarchy, wherein women are evil and men are good. I argue that this binary is further emphasized by Seeley's understanding of God as a masculine figure, placing Shug in a position that directly opposes God. However, as Seeley is giving Shug a bath, she states, "I wash her body, it feel like I'm praying." This quote portrays Seeley being overcome with a feeling she has only felt before when praying, signaling the beginning of an experience where Seeley's patriarchal beliefs about religion are called into question. Seeley's evolving relationship with Shug is the catalyst for Seeley's eventual understanding that God doesn't exist within a male-female binary, but rather is a divine spirit that is infused within her life. Conclusively, the main character of Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Seeley, finds freedom from her isolation, which is emphasized by patriarchal notions, through an evolved perception of God that transcends the male-female binary. I argue that Seeley is freed from the constraints of patriarchy by reimagining God from a male figure to a genderless and divine spirit that is present within her and everything around her. As Shug Avery once tells Seeley, "I believe God is everything. Everything that is, or ever was, or ever will be. And when you can feel that, and be happy to feel that, you've found it."
Dog Eaters by Jessica Hagedorn deliberately contrasts with other narrative works and theories by portraying evil as not banal, but rather spectacular. Dog Eaters examines the ways in which spectacle can be used as a weapon and as a distraction, how spectacle tests the importance of valuable relationships, and how it corrupts. There are two separate formats with a variety of differences, specifically a book and play format of Dog Eaters that can be analyzed. The primary focus of both the text and play is a celebration of the Philippines and Filipino culture and a harsh anti-authoritarian critique of the Philippines leadership of the 50s and 80s. The government of the novel is based on the real dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos from the 50s and 80s in the Philippines with Hagedorn, who is Filipino-American despised. Hagedorn combines these themes by analyzing the ways in which heartfelt examples of Philippine culture are cynically exploited by the government and how search for fame or material gain aligns the characters. Hagedorn chooses to depict authoritarianism and Philippine society along the lines of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle theorized that modern society isolates individuals from meaningful fulfillment or connection through the ghosts of these aspects. That modern civilization prioritizes superficial gain, fame, material gain over true connection and hollows out society. Guy Debord analyzed the ways in which the spectacle is used by powerful or wealthy individuals and how, on a personal level, spectacle erodes true connection. Hagedorn, who seems to take inspiration from a variety of other authors and theorists, bases her interpretation, in large part, along a Debordian line. Hagedorn applies this not just to society and interpersonal relations, but towards depicting the authoritarian government's use of spectacle. Hagedorn's intention provides a compelling contrast to Hannah Arendt's view of evil. Famously, Hannah Arendt studied Nazi high command officer and crucial Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann, which she detailed in Eichmann in Jerusalem. She noted that Eichmann was not insane, nor psychopathic, but instead ordinary, boring, a bureaucrat in the wrong organization. Yet he had played a massive role in organizing one of the most horrendous atrocities in human history. The lesson was that the most atrocious evils can be committed by psychologically normal people, and that no one is immune to committing atrocious acts. Indeed, throughout virtually every despotic organization, we can see the banality of evil explain why everyday, ordinary people can commit awful atrocities and believe they are justified. In Dog Eaters, however, the oppressive government officials that we get to know, such as General Ledesma, are not portrayed as psychologically ordinary men. Melba Marcos is portrayed as comically fascist and out of touch, and General Ledesma is shown to be abusive and organized the rape of his niece. The only touch of this psychologically ordinary evil that we see is from Ledesma's wife Leonore and her hypocritical religious beliefs. Deliver us from evil, forgive our sins, but not theirs. While I would argue that there is nothing inherently contradictory between Hagedorn's belief and discovery of authoritarianism, I would argue Hagedorn deliberately chooses to focus on different aspects. Despite the focus on spectacle, there are numerous ways in which banality is explored through this lens. The charismatic, flashy government influenced by the culture of the Philippines is shown to corrupt ordinary society and life. Even though characters such as Ledesma are portrayed as the embodiment of malice and corruption, the text makes clear that ordinary people support said government. Rather, Hagedorn focused on a more spectacular view of despotism, which she uses to explore how the ordinary man goes along. Arendt uses Adolf Eichmann to analyze how psychologically ordinary man can be crucial in committing horrendous atrocities. Guy Debord's work is about society as a whole, which Hagedorn takes inspiration from, but primarily as fuel for the autocratic government. Yet Debord does make a central claim that power is the height of spectacle, and power uses spectacle as a tool. The oldest social specialization of power, is at the root of spectacle. The spectacle is thus a specialized activity, which speaks for all the others. Power is explored as the root of spectacle, and Arendt analyzes how power and social normalization leads to the worst horrors. Jessica Hagedorn's depiction of the Philippines is a celebration of culture and a critique of the hollow, spectacle-consumed society, which is exploited. Hagedorn's government deliberately depicts itself as one with society through a charismatic spectacle that is ultimately hollow. As Debord puts it, the spectacle presents itself as simultaneously all of society, as part of society, and as an instrument of unification. The government in Dog Eaters simultaneously tightens all control and tries to feel themselves as the people, while simultaneously downplaying that control when it is no longer convenient. This is evidenced by the government's downplaying their crimes and using public institutions which they control to deny said control, as noted. In public, the senator and general are polite and cordial. Their wives attend the same church. The fact that Daisy's father is still alive is exploited by our wily president. You see, this is a free country. Just ask Domingo Avila. Senator Domingo Avila was assassinated by the government shortly after said remarks. An oppressive government uses the church, which should oppose all they stand for, as cover. They control these institutions in the country unofficially and covertly assassinate political rivals that they simultaneously claim are proof they are a free country. Hagedorn's depiction of authoritarianism indicates how a despotic government wins support and appeal despite open crackdowns and martial law. According to scholar Kristen Twelbeck, Hagedorn depicts a crushing surveillance, both literal and metaphorical, in dog eaters. On both the aesthetic levels and narrative levels, the world of dog eaters is a system of absolute surveillance. Secret police are everywhere, and the media functions as an instrument of government control. The direct rule is through a mixture of fear and propaganda, with the government taking control of media and be willing to crush opposition. In this regard, there is nothing special about the beings depicted by Hagedorn. Yet most notably, the society is deeply flashy and charismatic, and that spectacularity has been incorporated by the government as a tool. How can a politically oppressed society in which the ordained spectacle has been integrated into the real gain control over its existence? How can the reader wake up to what's really happening into Hagedorn's intense dream world? Both book and play exist in a flashy, over-the-top, yet strange and almost dreamlike state, much like the government intends to keep society. So many stories, a vaudeville of doomed love, shameless desires, dreams, and longing. Someone always laughs, someone always cries, someone always dies. The story in society may be depicted as spectacular, yet the suffering is very much not, and the oppression is not fictional. The Marcos regime's intention to create a spectacular, material-driven society influences the actions of resistance. And while there may be an intense macro focus on the way in which overall society functions in dog eaters, there's an equally important micro focus. On a personal level, we see a variety of characters which have degrees of selfishness, vapidity, and selfishness which contradict and indicate how superficial materialism blinds them to what is really important. For instance, lovers Romeo and Trini are shown to be rather vapid and selfish, with Romeo primarily caring about his acting career and Trini seeing him almost as a trophy boyfriend. It would be easy to assume this vapidity of being caught up in the spectacle of one another, but they do not value each other. You're not foolish, Trini. You're good-hearted and sweet, and that would make any man happy. It's just, well, my buddy came from the location and has promised to arrange a test for this week. Romeo ends up putting his career before Trini and breaks up with her. Yet when he is shot and killed, almost immediately after this, all they can think about is each other in their final moments. These two characters who loved and valued each other, but prioritized spectacle and materialism until it was too late, sum up the whole story. Throughout the story, we see this ways in which this cultural vapidity and selfishness are exploited by the authoritarian government by taking advantage of genuinely heartfelt and meaningful aspects of relationships and culture. Both book and play celebrate Filipino culture while simultaneously being a rightfully ruthless critique of the Marcos regime's authoritarianism. Hagedorn's bittersweet narrative shines light on how spectacle in the Philippines contributes towards deep authoritarian rot and twists what is most valuable. It still loves the Philippines and offers a ray of hope for the continued future. Hagedorn combines love, spectacle, and authoritarianism by analyzing how the Philippines has been deliberately hollowed out by the government and how characters are blinded by superficial gain. Through noting how Dog Eaters theorizes about the impact of spectacle and authoritarianism and how public consent is manufactured through media and ultimately hollow spectacle, perhaps societies can learn to reduce their own odds of falling into despotism in the future.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Yes, Claire.
My question is for Jacob. So I know we talked about this a little in class, like working in a group, and you mentioned it now, like at the beginning of your paper, the fact that there's a book and a play version of your text. Could you like give some of the reasoning behind, like, because you chose the play version, could you like give some of the reasoning behind making that choice, like if there is any, or like maybe it was just vibes, I don't know.
Yes, so when I went into this, I wanted to explore the theme of banality of evil. Yet the more I sort of dug into the text, the more I realized that there wasn't a lot of that in the story. And as I developed it, I realized that there was an equally important focus rather on deliberate, over-the-top spectacle, flair, and flashiness that is used to cover up fundamentally evil authoritarian actions. And this is the central theme that is explored through both the book and play. And the play takes this deliberate, like over-the-top, flashy, it's almost dreamlike state. And I felt that this idea of the play exploring these like deliberate, charismatic spectacle, flashy, over-the-top themes, while hiding a very dark future, felt very fitting to the core of what I was trying to explore.
Yes.
I have a question for Emma. I think it's, well, such. And I wanted to ask, what drew you to that? Like, what drew you to exploring a man's perspective? Like, I know that sounds really weird, but I'm just curious.
Honestly, it all started off with I wanted to explore something within disability, and then I got a recommendation from Professor Brennan, and I did end up really liking the book, and like I thought it was kind of interesting to look through like a man's perspective on like what that might mean, especially in the 1920s, and like the context of post-World War I, and kind of and like looking at how you may not like always think of disability in other ways than maybe medical wise, like stereotypical medical wise, or like just purely physical from like just looking at someone. So then looking through like something that may seem invisible but is like extremely important to that time period is very interesting, such as in like also looking at like how that works within being like a veteran compared to other veterans.
Yes. My question is also for, is it Jacob? So I know you touched on how like in your thesis, like the spectacle of that, like, you know, over the top makes the, I guess, like makes the evil a little, maybe makes it more normal. Did you touch on in your like thesis at all how the like that spectacle can kind of turn the everyday society of like society in a war, in a dictatorship, to make it normal, make it seem normal at all?
That's something that I've actually thought about quite a bit, but I don't analyze it very much in the text because that's not how the story plays out either in the text or at the time the novel and play were released in the novel and play. Rather, one of the themes, if anything, is continuing cycles and how the same cycles of violence repeat themselves. And it's mentioned at the very end that casually that the government has been overthrown, or not overthrown, but that the current government is no longer the same one that's in power, and yet we never see any fallout of this. It's just mentioned as deliberately as a casual, just like throwaway line. And I thought that was very interesting because it was very much the story of how these cycles keep repeating, and even how when one government can be overthrown or removed or just get out of power naturally, another one that can come in can just repeat the cycle, and how we see this throughout the story, all this focus on this specific government, and then it's just casually mentioned as an afterthought. Oh yeah, this was overthrown. So I felt the story was deliberately not depicting how that happens, but rather why it happens in the first place.
My question's for Kara. Kind of like in an alternate universe type questions, so bear with me. But do you think that like the genderlessness that is eventually, like, do you think that's required for a holistic view of divinity, or like in like an alternate world, if God had been presented as female like from the start, or if like she starts to think of God as like a female character instead of a genderless character, like how do you think that would have played out, or do you think that the genderlessness is what makes it holistic?
Mm-hmm. I would say, just based off of the text that I analyzed alone, The Color Purple, I would say that having a genderless divine spirit is essential for it being like holistic or something that doesn't seek to oppress people. That's something that I try to focus on in my thesis, is that like the male-female binary that exists within Seeley's world and our world, wherein male people are on top and female people are on the bottom, like swapping those like wouldn't do anything to like for inclusivity. Like it would simply just put another group of people on top and another group of people on the bottom, and I believe that wouldn't have helped Seeley find like hope in things, because she has many close relationships with women, but also within her community and the people she cares about, there are many men too. And what I was really seeking to define was like, how does her shifting sense of God allow her to find this kind of like hope and like empowerment within her community, so that they can all kind of overcome like these oppressive power structures of patriarchy and racism and things like that. So.
This is for Emma. So, in one of the quotes you said, it was like the doctor telling the main character that his disability was like a great sacrifice for being born. So my question is, that seems like, I wouldn't say it's like a positive reaction towards his disability, but it's more positive than what the other characters were reacting towards him. So my question is there any like other examples of him like positive reactions towards his disability within the novel?
As in like positive wise, maybe more like neutral wise, I would say, like in speaking with maybe other like veterans, it's more of like a I understand type thing. I mean, of course it's not like a mutual kind of understanding, but I would say like there's not so much like more positive things as it is like neutral, if it's not like negative really.
One more question?
Yeah, I was wondering, my question's for Emma. I was wondering how he copes with being disabled, with being like excluded from things, and if he's the only one with that disability in like the whole book that's mentioned.
Yeah, so he is the only one who is like impotent. And to say he copes, he's definitely, it's very isolating for him. He talks like very negatively kind of about some of the things he may experience because of that. But it's like, I feel like at the end of the day, it's always like a, oh, well, kind of thing. It's like a, well, I can't do anything about it. But it's like, he definitely doesn't like cope well, I'll say that. It's just kind of like because of the back and forth with Brett, I think that kind of makes it worse, because then he sees her getting into these relationships with other men, even within the friend group. And so then, like, it's like a constant like turmoil of like, it's not gonna happen type thing.
All right, thank you very much. One more. I will invite you to welcome to the stage our own Annette Duncan, whom I'm surprising at this very moment. So, Professor Annette Duncan.
All right. I would like to introduce the next panel. It is too small for me to read. I'm sorry, somebody please.
Welcome.
Welcome is the word. Welcome to New York. And it is Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. We have three very esteemed panelists who I would invite to come on up. So again, we're going to hear from Lauren Klinger, Madison McLean, and Claire Holst. Right up here first, Lauren. She is going to be looking at the topic, It All Seemed Against My Nature, Gender Identity in Patti Smith's Just Kids. So, Lauren.
There are two potential ways that we as humans come to understand our existence and identity. One is in the moment. We experience something, and it reveals an aspect of ourselves that we did not realize before. However, the more common case is that we reflect. You come to understand certain aspects of your identity based on reflection and introspection. I will explore this idea further by looking at the moments of introspection in order to help us understand the identity of Patti Smith and her memoir, Just Kids. I argue that Smith's memoir is a project of self-invention through the reflective act of writing, and that the gendered self she discovers is imbued with plurality throughout. The goal of my thesis is to explore and understand how gender functions within Smith's memoir as an exploration of her identity. I aim to prove the intentionality behind the memoir form, as well as to showcase how this growth and change exhibited in Smith's reflections serve as the markers of a shifting identity. She is also an example of a non-traditional woman, and so my goal is to explore how gender functions for a woman who is non-conforming, which will allow me to argue that the reflective aspects of the memoir influence the development and understanding of gender as well. So often, the memoir is credited as an unreliable source of events in the past, but how can that be beneficial in understanding someone's gender and identity? Does it create a false narrative based on influences from the author's current psyche? Or does it allow for a more truthful and insightful past to be revealed? My intervention is that I'm using this memoir form as a lens that not only helps us understand a person's identity more deeply, but also shapes it. Since memoir is much more intentional than an autobiography, there's much more to be said about what the author includes when recounting their life story. The memoir form is so focused on reflection and offers the time to mull over events within their lives. The question I aim to answer is, how does that influence not only they as the author, but we as the reader, perceive their life and identity? In regards to Smith's memoir, I argue that her choice of genre and subsequent intentionality associated with writing a memoir allows for Smith to explore the moments within her life that reveal aspects of duality as they relate to her gender. Within my larger project, these ideas are split into two sub-arguments. The first aims to prove the intentionality behind the memoir and the powerful influence reflective writing has on understanding a person's identity. The second sub-argument brings the intentionality of the memoir form into the realm of gender, which aims to prove the direct influence of the memoir form on how Smith perceived her own gender. I argue that the text reveals her gender to function as a lens through which to understand the plurality of her life. I specifically look at gender as it relates to the body and the function of the body. Judith Butler's text, Gender Trouble, specifically the chapter titled Bodily Inscriptions, Performative Subversions, discusses the body as what Butler describes can be figured as a surface and the scene of cultural inscription. In earlier moments of the text, Smith's gender is inscribed onto her body by her mother, who reinforces societal norms when reprimanding Smith for acting the same as the boys she was playing with by going shirtless, something she had done consistently while growing up. Smith's gender is inscribed in this notion of covering. She is automatically labeled as an other due to the nature of her bodily presentation and what is expected of her as a woman. Smith's interpretation of this moment, offered to us through reflection thanks to her use of the memoir form, is one of discontentment and confusion, as she remarks that it all seemed against my nature. Despite her mother perpetuating what we understand to be a societal norm, it is far from normal for Smith, highlighting Smith's disagreement with typical gender norms and setting her future up as a woman who doesn't allow herself to be defined by what society deems her to be. Smith's confliction with her gender is apparent when she experiences an unplanned pregnancy at the age of 17 and remarks she was humbled by nature. Using Leonard Davis's text, Enforcing Normalcy, in a chapter titled Visualing the Disabled Body, the Classical Nude and Fragmented Torso, Smith's experience with pregnancy can be understood through a gendered and functional lens. While Davis is more focused on looking at what it means to have a disabled body in society and the implications of the juxtaposition between abled and disabled, I argue that Davis's conversation is relevant in the realm of gender and functionality as a woman, specifically as it relates to pregnancy. Davis argues that the coding of body parts and the importance attached to their selective function or dysfunction is part of a much larger system of signs and meanings in society and is constructed as such. Davis's definition of bodily inscription can be used in direct relation to Butler's understanding of the body, with Davis' support in regards to the function of a woman's body as it relates to this inscription being particularly relevant when understanding the role of pregnancy and motherhood as part of a woman's identity, and the intricacies of this assumed duality of the part of society and what it means to abstain from this assumption. Understanding this identity development through pregnancy can also be understood through what Katie Collins calls the site of discursive and psychic reproduction of the conservative sexual order in her essay titled The Morbidity of Maternity. While the lens of queerness that Collins uses cannot be directly tied to Smith, other than through speculation and assumption based on appearance, what can be understood is the perseverance of conservative social order. The functionality of a woman's body is tied directly to their value, and the subsequent production is also tied directly to their value. For Smith to choose to participate in the function of pregnancy, but not the result or product of motherhood, paints an interesting picture when understanding her contribution to this so-called heterosexual social order. This social order is defined as upholding both the production and the product in the realm of a woman's body. Her participation in the production cements her as a woman, but her lack of product, in this case, motherhood, prevents her from fulfilling that social order so defined by Collins. As a result, Smith's identity cannot be fulfilled either. Her sense of self is riddled with dichotomous contradictions, as she remarks that despite I, who never wanted to be a girl or grow up, would be faced with this trial. What I mean by this is that Smith, as a result of partial participation by the definition of society, is living in a limbo between one role and another, not fully woman, but also still being defined as one, not wishing to grow up, yet having to grow up faster than normal. Being that this is a memoir, meaning all moments were by choice rather than happenstance, suggests that Smith wrote this to serve the purpose of exploring her understanding of what it means to be a woman. She includes the formative moments where her identity was in contention, whether it be due to social norms or her own personal misunderstandings or misconceptions, and her reflection allows both herself and us as readers to understand what it means when she writes that she was accepted but never really fit in, or when she craved honesty yet found dishonesty in herself. Her use of the memoir form creates a space where the dualities of gender and identity can be explored, and her discontentment and restless identity can be established and understood before it develops and changes throughout the text. When Patti Smith wrote her memoir, it's unclear whether or not she would understand just how impactful her own personal reflections would be on getting a better understanding of the human experience as a woman and the way we can understand the functionality and plurality of gender. The intentionality of the memoir form allows for a more insightful look into a person's life and lets us as readers understand how the author views themselves. So we can see how Smith views her own gender and identity and how that influenced her development into the person she is today.
Hello. Okay. My project investigates the relationship between the two forms of grief seen within the unnamed main character of the novel, living in New York City during the time of the 9/11 attacks. Most scholars argue that the main character hibernates as a response to her grief. I argue that the main character is dealing with a prolonged feeling of mourning and melancholia, and chooses to go through her year of rest and relaxation because of the depression that comes with this feeling of these two forms of grief. I will demonstrate this by first sharing research on Freud's essay on mourning and melancholia, comparing how it is linked to the public and private spaces, and suggesting that grief never ends. This matters because it offers an alternative perspective on grief, providing a more profound understanding. Within this theory, Freud defines mourning as a distinct form of grieving. Mourning is a feeling that resolves, whereas melancholia persists. Melancholia involves an ambient relationship to a lost object, characterized by feeling of grief over the loss of an object. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud defines mourning as the reaction to loss of a beloved person, or to the loss of some abstraction which has taken the place of one, such as one's country, liberty, ideal, and so on. He then states that sometimes people produce melancholia rather than genuine mourning. The features of melancholia, according to Freud, include a profoundly painful depression, lack of interest in the outside world, and loss of the capacity to love. Mourning and melancholia reframes my questions, linking them both to both public and private spaces. By analyzing public and private spaces through Freud's theories on mourning and melancholia, we can gain a deeper understanding of where grief is felt and how it is experienced within these spaces. This is seen through the novel due to the main character's need for privacy. We notice a significant difference in her behavior in public compared to private spaces because of the need to isolate herself. In the short, I will prove that the two forms of grief, mourning and melancholia, are tied to public and private, while analyzing how these terms function within the novel through the main character as she hibernates. The main character experiences feelings of mourning and melancholia in public and private spaces, and we can examine how she deals with each one separately. In this example, we focus on how she navigates a public setting. This is evident where the main character goes to her best friend Reva's house to get ready for her mom's funeral, but ends up immediately retreating to Reva's room, lying in her bed to rest before the funeral while her friend gets ready. I really need to lie down, Reva, I told her. I don't feel well. All right, she said. Follow me. We walked through the sitting room. Dad, don't let anyone go downstairs. My friend needs some privacy. Pondering all of this down in Reva's black room, under her sad, frilly sheets, I felt nothing. I could think of feelings, emotions, but I couldn't bring them up in me. I couldn't even locate where my emotions came from. My brain, it made no sense. The main character is showing grief through mourning, which is fitting since she is getting ready for a funeral. But in this instance, she is mourning not for the loss of her friend's mother, but because she is grieving in a public space, in Reba's house. While in this public space, though private to Reba and her family, the main character must pass through the living room, be introduced to the family, be offered food, but retreats to the basement for privacy, which is still a public space since it is outside the comfort of the main character's home. This is evident through the change in mindset of becoming more emotional, rather than how she acts when she hibernates in private. Rather than being in a more emotional mindset when grieving in public with Reba in her friend's bedroom, the main character acts and thinks differently when she is alone in the comfort of her own apartment, experience a more relaxed state, a state where she is hidden from society, where she can easily transition in and out of sleep unencumbered by any thoughts or emotions, simply focusing on the slumber. To view an example of the main character grieving privately, we can examine a passage near the beginning of the book, in chapter 2, where she is just beginning her year of rest and relaxation, where she explains how time feels to her and how her brain adapts to this new lifestyle. The speed of time varies, fast or slow, depending on the depth of my sleep. I become very sensitive to the taste of water from the tap. Sometimes it was cloudy and tasted of soft minerals. Other times it was gassy and tasted like somebody's bad breath. My favorite days were the ones that barely registered. I catch myself not breathing, slumped on the sofa, staring at my eddy of dust tumbling across the hardwood floor in the draft, and I'd remember that I was alive for a second, then fade back out. Achieving that state took heavy dosages of Seroquel or lithium combined with Xanax, Ambien, or Trazodone, and I didn't want to overuse those prescriptions. While in a private space, she can be classified as grieving in a melancholic way instead of mourning, since she is by herself. While dealing with this version of grief, the main character silences it through the use of multiple mixtures of pills. She does this to pass the time, to hibernate without being disturbed by these thoughts from being awake for too long. Rather than carefully considering the nature of feelings and emotions in a public space, she is registering unconscious here in private, which reveals her desire to escape and isolation, seeking to be alone and enter an undisturbed, unconscious state. My year of rest and relaxation shows us that grief doesn't just go away. It only changes depending on whether it's being experienced publicly or privately. Using Freud's theory, mourning and melancholia, we can see that the main character mourns when around others and falls into melancholia while alone. Her year of sleep isn't just an escape from society. Instead, it's a coping mechanism for dealing with her intense grief. Through the use of 9/11 in the novel, Mashva reminds readers that even when mourning ends, melancholia can still linger. Thank you.
The spaces we inhabit do not merely provide a backdrop for our lives. They tell stories, recording history, culture, connection, and community. Girls, Visions, and Everything reveals a network of spaces in New York City that tell a vibrant story of queer expression, desire, and creativity. The novel centers around a community of queer artists, including Lila Federansky, protagonist and aspiring author. Lila frequents an establishment cleverly named The Kitchen, a play on words that twist ideas of domesticity and artistic culture together. Kitsch refers to art commonly considered lowbrow, gauche, or eccentric, though specific audiences appreciate and curate it. Although Lila's scope of community expands far beyond the boundaries of The Kitchen, she meets multiple crucial characters through this comic space, including one of her main love interests, Emily Harrison. The radical nature and significance of this space to the queer community in the novel is that serves as a space for accessible artistic creation, that fosters a strong sense of community, and it allows for queer sexual expression. Through this, Girls, Visions, and Everything demonstrates a strong relationship between art-making spaces and queer sexuality in New York during the 1980s. Queer communities thrive in art-making spaces as they provide an environment that allows for expression in ways that are atypical of many public spaces. In the 1999 preface to the novel, Sarah Schulman writes, "Simultaneously, there was the revelatory necessity of making a new worldview out of both creative energy and deep misunderstood deprivation." Girls, Visions, and Everything is also a novel about neighborhood, a community defined by its geography.
The geographical makeup of the novel is fundamental in relation to this idea, as well as on how notions of community are portrayed throughout the story. Scholars such as Jill Valentine and Alla Ivachikova argue that public spaces are governed by heteronormative rules, which strictly police deviance from supposed norms. Further, they claim that lesbians often restructure this space by simply being, visibly defying gender binaries and opening the space up for queer expression. As I further develop my thesis, I expand on this idea, claiming that not only does Lila disrupt ideas of heteronormativity through habitation of the street, she queers the street, opening it up for general deviance from the norm and creating opportunities for community building. In my thesis, I first demonstrate how the concept of exhibitionism operates in both public and private spheres, exploring the connection between art making and queer sexuality. Then I introduce Lila as a figure who reconstructs public and private ideas through her expression and street wandering. To support these ideas, I will draw on the theory of Warren Berlant and Michael Warner. Ultimately, I consider the novel's geographical makeup in relation to the story and make a more expansive statement on the centrality of art-making spaces to the community. Today, I will expand on the term space, specifically as it relates to the novel, as its usage in context is crucial to the argument of my larger essay. Henry Lefebvre argues that space is a social product directly influencing social practices. Lefebvre expands on the Marxist concept of means of production to claim that space is not only means of production, but also means of control. The Lefebvrean social product of space is conceptualized from three perspectives: physical, what the actual space is; mental, how the space is represented; and social, how the space is lived in by people. From Lefebvre's definition of space, we can then form a more accurate definition of queer space specifically. Queer space is often referred to in a much more fluid manner than other forms of space, making it more challenging to define and characterize as a single distinct entity. Instead of trying to erase this concept of fluidity to form a concrete definition, though, many scholars utilize it to understand what queer space is. In her text, Queer Constellations, Subcultural Space in the Wake of the City, Diane Chisholm defines queer space as such. Queer space demarcates the practice, production, and performance of space beyond just the mere habitation of built and fixed structures. This aligns with Lefebvre's concept of space being socially produced by multiple factors that extend beyond the actual physical space. Queer space is fluid and constantly evolving because it is shaped by numerous characteristics that transcend fixed physical boundaries. Specifically, the environments around queer spaces significantly affect them, especially oppressive ones. Queer spaces are created as a result of and in response to active subjugation. In Laura Ma's dissertation, Her City Was the Most Beautiful Woman, mapping the queer spaces of Sarah Schulman's New York and Groceries and Everything, People in Trouble, and Rat Bohemia, she speaks on the spaces in three of Schulman's novels. Referring to a scene in Groceries and Everything, where multiple men harass Lila and Emily, she states, "The blurring of private and public for the queer subject signifies an inescapable and panoptic oppression. It is this which drives Schulman's protagonists to create their own spaces, which disable their surveillance and offer authentic privacy." Ma reinforces the claim that queerness is subject to heterosexual regulation and surveillance in the public sphere, while introducing a new claim that Schulman makes about infringement on the private sphere by these sovereignties. Not only do the heteronormative functions of society require that queerness be regulated in the public sphere, but this passage also exemplifies that it is being regulated in the private sphere. Public space is closed off to the queer community. It becomes a privilege only accessible to the heterosexual public. Concurrently, queer private space is opened up to continuous surveillance and a lingering threat of violence. Because of this aggressive depriving of the queer community's right to expression and safety, queer people are consequently called upon to create their own spaces away from this surveillance. In Girls' Visions and Everything, this notion of creating a queer space functions in multiple ways. Firstly, queer space exists in the functions of the kitchen. The kitchen is the local lesbian clubhouse in the novel, which provides community building opportunities and affordable artistic opportunities for lesbians on the Lower East Side. Secondly, queer space exists in the networks formed in the streets through Lila's wandering. This space may be less immediately apparent as a queer space because it exists as one by utilizing a less commonplace definition of the word queerness. Here, we would define queerness as anything that works in opposition to heteronormative systems, which includes but is not limited to homosexuality. In part one of the novel, two of Lila's creative friends, Sally Liberty and Lacey Burns, recall an instance of when they opposed heteronormative systems. Sally starts, quote, "Then, last Friday, this woman came back and announced that from now on, all the gardens had to be square, and ours is round. So she demanded that we take it apart and make it square. Sally and Lacey refused to give in and make their running round, denying their participation in a hegemonic neighborhood and actively engaging in a clearing of the space. Further, look around you, Lacey said. There's thousands of abandoned apartments and people with no homes, and all the city cares about is our garden. Quote. The street is queer because it allows for this kind of oppositional framework to thrive, making the street a space for congregation of a diverse range of people, specifically marginalized communities who are unwelcome in other areas. Lila's Wandering opens the street to this kind of wording, which I will expand on further in my larger paper. By defining what queer space means, naming some of the queer spaces in the novel, and underscoring their value to the novel, I laid groundwork of understanding that would be crucial to understanding ideas present in my complete thesis, namely how the novel utilizes queer space as a storytelling device, along with how it showcases its functionality for the queer community. This all emphasizes the impact that having creative, accessible, queer-centered spaces has in the community, especially during times of struggle and as a means of resistance. My thesis demonstrates how queer spaces function as networks of resistance in New York during the 1980s, and how Girls' Issues and Everything historicizes these spaces.
This is such a privilege, isn't it, to be able to come together and just enjoy thinking and wrestling with ideas. Our panelists did a wonderful job. What questions do you have?
So my question is for Lauren. So you talked a lot about how Smith, like, she repeatedly considers, she still very much considers herself a woman, despite these, like, conflicts of her gender identity. Does she talk about at all, like, considering transitioning in any way, talk about trans people, or is she, like, very vehemently, like, just focused on being a woman the entire time?
She doesn't necessarily talk about her gender a whole lot. The only time she really mentions being anything other than a heteronormative, like, straight woman is later in the novel, when she talks about, somebody calls her androgynous, and she doesn't really know what that means, but then she embraces the term. But other than that, she does not make any mention of being other than kind of a woman and who she is. And she also, in her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, who's a prominent photographer of the time, she kind of also establishes her femininity and womanhood in her relationship with him.
For Maddie. So in your first quote, Reva's friend seems to, like, immediately understand her need for hibernation, and I guess I'm thinking in the face of so much, like, mental health stigmatization, how do the other characters react? Like, is it negative, positive? Do they understand her need for this privacy?
Well, the funny thing about Reva is she kind of goes along with it until she kind of she does go along with it until she steals her pills. So there's only so much she can take, I guess, from the main character kind of acting this way, because she is kind of acting in out of privilege in a way, and Reva is jealous of her life. So I think she kind of is like, you're done. So she steals her pills, and in order to kind of get her out of that situation, because it's a situation. But I would say there aren't really many other characters in this novel other than her ex-boyfriend, who kind of pops in and out, who does not care, and her psychiatrist, who gives her the pills. She prescribes them for her through the main character lying to, in order to receive them. So it's all it's many different situations going on in there, but most are built on kind of with the psychiatrist, it's built on a lie. With a friend, it's built on a fake friendship in a way, because Reva just really is jealous of the main character. I hope that answered your question.
Yes. A question for Claire. So your novel, you mentioned, is kind of based in the 1980s in New York. Obviously, we know a lot has happened between the 80s and now.
in terms of queer culture, and just obviously things are constantly evolving. Do you feel like in the way that queer spaces are talked about and like often created in that time, do you think if there's any application to now, like are spaces created in the same way? Do they look the same? Like, have you done any comparison work through your thesis?
That's a really good question. I think it's kind of tricky because I'm looking at such a urban space and looking at New York specifically, which is so queer, I guess. Like it's like a hot spot of culture in so many ways. And I think being in a more rural area, it's hard to make a comparison. But I like had the privilege of visiting New York over the summer and like seeing some of the queer spaces. I didn't like visit for very long, but like for a week. And I think it's changed in ways of like I'm trying to word this in a way that makes sense. Like there was so much struggle at the time. Not that queer people aren't still struggling. There's obviously still things going on always, but there was so much struggle and so much going on that like these spaces were kind of forced to be created. And so I think now it's more like spaces are created out of like queer joy versus like a queer struggle. Like it's like, oh, we want to come together and make a club for fun. Like we want to have a gay club that we go to and drink together. And I think sometimes maybe the history of the struggle gets lost. I do think there is a lot of focus still on art making spaces though, and like that kind of thing. I think that just is, it just does kind of get lost. I think also there were a lot more lesbian centered spaces then. Like I'm reading like in the book they're talking about like there's a lesbian clubhouse here and there, and I'm like, that's really not so much happening anymore. So I do think it's changed in that there's not so much like widespread struggle constantly that's like necessitating these spaces anymore, if that makes sense.
This is for Maddie. In both Lauren and Claire's thesis, they kind of talk about the community that they find in New York, and like New York is very notorious for the sense of community that the city brings. So, does your character ever find community?
I should say that. That is a good question. I really don't think so. She's a very selfish character. The only time I can see her being like, pardon the wrong word, but unselfish, is when she gives her clothes away to Reva, because she's trying to clear out her entire apartment in order to like finish her year of rest and relaxation by like getting rid of everything to become someone new. So I really don't think she's thinking that way. She's really only thinking about herself and how she can how she can better herself by herself. I think that's the only way I can answer that question. I'm so sorry.
Maybe one more question.
For Lauren, I know that this is an autobiography. I was curious, are there times where you would, I know that she's like the narrator and describing the events, but are there times where you disagree with her interpretations of like events or like relationships or people in her life that she
Yes. Yeah. That was actually going to be originally the main part of my thesis, because in her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, there were a lot of times where I was like, girl, you were sacrificing so much for this man. Like, go live your life and be awesome. Which is what she did eventually. But the way that she describes it, she didn't see it as a sacrifice most of the time. There is one point in the novel, or the memoir, where she actually remarks that she made a sacrifice. But I could count on like both hands times before that where I was like, you were sacrificing for him. But she didn't realize that. And so, yes, I disagree, but I also think that it reveals a lot about how she sees herself and her relationship with Robert, which is then what I chose to focus on analyzing.
All right, let's give one more round of applause.
I'll invite you to welcome Professor David Garcia.
Hi there, folks. So happy to be providing bookends on this experience, having done the first one yesterday and the last one today. Great thing. So why don't we have our three panelists come on down? So Mackenzie, Piper. This is a panel entitled Gender, Freedom, and Resistance in Late 20th Century Science Fiction. I'll be very interested to hear what our panelists have to say about this. First, we'll hear from Mackenzie Thesis, who will read a paper entitled Fred's Tale: Resistance through Testimony. Should be followed by Freeman Wacholder, whose paper Man I Must Say, Translation of Gender in the Winds of That Kind of Darkness. And then last, Piper Dooley, who will sort of geek out on linguistic stuff. I imagine when we read her paper, the future is fixed, but meaning is yours, freedom in a determined universe, in Ted Chiang's story of your life. So please, one more round of applause, and welcome to
As I begin this paper, it is essential to disclose that resistance is ultimately unique to the individual being oppressed. Before proceeding, it is crucial for the audience to have a basic understanding of the main text I'll be interacting with. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood follows the experience of Offred, the handmaid, as she attempts to survive the dystopian society of Gilead, a society that is in place in the hopes of fixing the birth rate decline. In order to do so, women are oppressed severely to the point where they are sexually assaulted monthly and have their identities taken from them. In a state of oppression, Offred explores the unique modes of resistance that I have worked to uncover in my project. My overarching question engages with the work of several scholars and theorists, including Kelly Oliver, particularly in her studies on witnessing and testimony. Commonly, when scholars discuss the Handmaid's Tale, they are more concerned with complicity of those who are being oppressed, as the handmaids are seen from the outside as submissive to the regime, with their voices being stripped from them. I think the exact opposite. While I can see the conformity that occurs, I insist that in moments where conformity is imagined, it is directly used as a means of survival, which is resistance in itself. Considering the tactics of the regime are working to beat down a person, specifically in that Offred hasn't allowed her voice to be taken from her. She perseveres and continues to offer testimony to what she has witnessed. My thesis project, as briefly mentioned above, is especially interested in the ways resistance is categorized in Atwood's text. In my large thesis, I first argued that there is room for resistance in the context of oppression, which can be exercised in several spaces. Then I argued that Atwood enforces resistance within Offred through the way Offred utilizes memory and self-preservation. Before diving into the ways resistance is explored, I take note of why resistance is possible within Gilead, which matters because it aims to gain a deeper understanding of the resistance that is explored. Ultimately, I present an argument that testimony highlights a distinctive resistance tactic. Currently within the scope of this sub-project, I focus on the argument that while testimony is an act of resistance, I insist that its effectiveness is contingent upon who relays it. The testimony Offred gives, I argue, is the most vital towards the resistance. The idea I present is crucial because Offred's testimony serves as a form of resistance which audiences would not cultivate if it were given by the oppressors. My argument is important because audiences must understand the significance of considering the source of testimony of rebellion. If the testimony in this tale were given by the commander, it wouldn't serve as resistance. However, because it comes from the ultimate oppressed class, her testimony would serve as an act of resistance, as a sense of power is reclaimed in the state of being powerless. As a guide to the sub-project, I believe it's paramount to outline how I will approach making the argument that testimony itself isn't inherently resistant, but can be an ultimate act of resistance, depending on who the audience is hearing it from. First, I prove the concept of testimony is crucial, depending on who provides it. I substantiate this through the use of secondary sources, including Kelly Oliver's work and the ideas she presents in Witnessing and Testimony, alongside an overview of the key terms. Ultimately, I prove my argument's validity with a summary of close readings derived from Atwood's text. Before I dive into the movements, I make an argument. It is essential that I take note of the key terms I encounter during this discussion. which can ultimately be validated through the interaction with Oliver. The keywords are testimony and resistance. Testimony is the narrative Offred gives of her experience alongside those around her, which is dependent on the things she has witnessed. Ultimately, resistance is anything that goes against the standards that are established within the Gilead regime, which can be seen as serving as a vessel for babies, remaining silent, and following an altered version of God's word. As mentioned before, Kelly Oliver is the author of Witnessing Testimony. This was a fruitful piece of theory that helped amplify and clarify the question I had. There are many points from her text that prove beneficial, but in the context of this argument, I draw attention to the excerpt. Her testimony is unique because she was an eyewitness. She was there, but it is not just because she was there, but why and how she was there that makes her testimony unique. This point by Oliver essentially insists that the uniqueness of testimony comes from why and how a person was exposed to an event in order to give said testimony. But I build upon this point made by Oliver by insisting readers understand that testimony is not only unique because of why and how a person was put in place to give testimony, but also why the testimony is being given in the first place. For Offred, her testimony is unique in the way Oliver insists upon, because she is in a position to give testimony because she is actively oppressed due to her gender and was put in a place of oppression by excessive force. With this point I build upon in mind, her testimony is unique because of why she is sharing it to begin with. As a way to familiarize readers with The Handmaid's Tale and further develop my argument, I include close readings of the moment from the text. As a way to familiarize readers with The Handmaid's Tale and further develop my argument, I include a close reading to reiterate that testimony alone doesn't equate to resistance. However, because of who Offred is, audiences can understand her as following the path of resistance through the testimony she gives, as she maintains sanity and the hope that her tale will be shared. In an excerpt from Atwood's text, Offred discloses, "I would like to believe this is a story I'm telling. I need to believe it. I must believe it. Those who can believe that such stories are only stories have a better chance. If it's a story I'm telling, then I have control over the ending. Then there will be an ending to the story, and real life will come after it. I can pick up where I left off." Resistance in Gilead is a tricky thing, but not entirely impossible. And in the scene from the text, Offred has a very clear sense of hope for a life after Gilead, where she can continue her life. I would also argue that this is a moment of self-preservation as she is reclaiming a smidge of control and using her voice, especially when she said, "I'm telling, then I have control over the ending." Despite Gilead having worked tirelessly to take Offred's voice, she's showcasing that she isn't letting that happen, resistance in all its glory. In relation to the prior quote from Atwood's text, I am led to Courtney Landis and her work titled "A Woman's Place is in the Resistance." She has a portion of the text that conveys the message that Offred's tale exists because it is an act of subversion in a culture committed to silencing women and any non-believer at every turn. I mention this point Landis makes because Offred wants to believe that she is telling a story, but understands it's not one of fiction, and is seemingly overwhelmed by this. But with the note from Landis, it is evident that Offred's hope in telling her story isn't pointless. It makes for self-preservation and an act of subversion against Gilead. If the excerpt from Atwood had been attributed to the oppressors of Gilead, readers wouldn't have categorized it as an act of rebellion because they are already in the highest power. They have no reason to obtain more, which only goes to show that it matters who, why, and how testimony is conveyed. The Handmaid's Tale has made for the most electrifying thoughts that I hadn't once thought about before reading this text as closely. I hadn't given much thought to the unique modes of resistance. My experience in understanding how people work against the regime mostly consisted of actively using one's voice to speak up. But Offred opens the door to seeing the ways resistance can occur on both a micro and macro level. It ultimately comes down to the construction of Gilead, which enables Offred to take her resistance to a deeper level, one that is personal to her experiences, and which audiences are privileged to understand through her testimony.
Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness follows the travels of Genli I, a representative of the Union of Planets known as the Ecumen. This organization was founded to facilitate mutually profitable trade between its member planets. Genli, as an envoy from the Ecumen, is tasked with inviting the planet Gethin into the alliance. Genli begins his mission with some understanding of Gethenian biology and society, thanks to the Ecumen's covert studies conducted by a group known as the First Investigators. Gethenians are distinct from humans one might encounter on any of the Ecumen's worlds. Gethenians have a month-long sexual cycle consisting of two phases, Somer and Kemer. During Somer, which makes up the majority of the cycle, Gethenians are androgynous, hermaphroditic, and lack sexual desire and potency. A Gathenian becomes sexually potent and capable of reproduction only during a short period each month known as Kemer. When two people in Kemer come into contact, they develop into male and female sexual roles. As one of the ecumen's investigators explains, no physiological habit is established, and the mother of several children may be the father of several more. Gathenian sex and gender is the primary premise, the what-if, that guides Le Guin's exploration of this planet and its people. Genli I, born into an Earth-like patriarchal society, acts as a familiar reference point for readers. One of the main themes of the novel is Genli's cultural misunderstandings. This is primarily expressed in his relationship with the politician Estraven, whom Genli initially distrusts, although by the end of the novel, he comes to understand that Estraven was trying to aid Genli's mission all along. With this understanding of Estraven comes Genli's belief that he also understands Gathenian culture and ways of being. In spite of Genli's conviction, scholars disagree on his literacy within Gathenian culture. Christine Cornell posits that by the end of Genli's journey, he is capable of understanding and effectively communicating with Gathenians. This is mainly signified by the trust and closeness he develops with Estraven throughout the novel, and especially as the two make a perilous trek across hundreds of miles of ice. Other scholars believe that Genli never comes to accurately understand Gathenians, arguing that Genli's approach to learning about the peoples of Gethin fails because he filters everything he learns through his own worldview instead of opening his mind to accept things as they are. Regardless of Genli's personal understanding, he is still tasked with the translation and literalization of their culture and ways of life. Sebastian Dubinsky believes this translation is possible. He states that in Le Guin's work, language is only a shaky bridge. However, there are deep structures, not only in language, but also in philosophical constructions that enable two cultures to understand each other if there is a will. Samantha Castleman takes a more nuanced stance, claiming that it is not translation alone, but also Genli's heteroglossic additions to his field notes, such as notes from the investigators, many Gathenian stories, and Estraven's journal entries that enable readers to learn Gathenian culture. I argue that over the course of the novel, Genli does improve his understanding of Gathenians. However, this understanding is still on his own terms and colored by his preconceptions. He attempts to translate not only alien bodies, but also to translate an oral culture into a textual one. This is important because this idea of translation calls into question the place and capabilities of writing in our society. In this essay, I demonstrate that writing and orality can be applied to understand the differences between the bodies and cultures present in Le Guin's novel. Then I prove that Genli's translations fail because of his prejudice, and finally, that Gathenian gender is not translatable into the textual form. The sole difference between the Gathenian and the human of the ecumen is in sexual form, yet this difference extends into culture and methods of communication. Genli's society, the ecumen, prefers writing, whereas Gathenian society prefers speech, although both societies do practice both methods. The written word and spoken word act as metaphor for the bodily differences and cultural tendencies of the respective societies. The written word, whether it is a birth certificate, letter, or newspaper, is written only once, and once completed, it is intended to remain the same forever. There may be second drafts, addendums, fore and after words, translations, and new interpretations, but the original will always be the same, just as, in general, the sex and gender of the ecumenical human does not change. Writing is meant to last. The ecumen operates in the same way. This spacefaring association must focus on the future, as Genli says, men's lives are too short to cope with the time jumps between worlds if there's no network and centrality, no control, no continuity to work through. When the duration of travel from one place to another enters the scale of decades, it becomes necessary to plan decades in advance and to maintain stability above all else. Perhaps that is why a planet's local government or group of representatives that communicates with the rest of the ecumen is known as a stability. This communication occurs through a device called the Ansible, which enables one to instantaneously text with stabilities on other planets. The spoken word, on the other hand, is both unique and consistently reproduced. From small talk to theater, speech is inherently ephemeral. No two performances are the same. Where writing tends to be a solitary activity, speech is social. There's no conversation without a partner, no performance without an audience, so thanks. The process of Kemer and the bodily transformation that occurs is like a conversation. Two people change in response to one another. A Gathenian alone cannot change, and one cannot have a conversation with oneself. Gathenian society also reflects properties of speech. Speech occurs only in the present, and the attitude on Gethin places great importance on presence. For example, the calendar identifies every year as the year 1. Genli explains, only the dating of every past and future year changes each New Year's Day, as one counts backwards or forwards from the unitary now. Such a system would be impossibly tedious in a writing-focused culture. The translation of an oral culture into a written form is a troublesome task, but Genli's translations fail long before he reaches this point. Genli can neither properly record nor translate Gathenian gender due to his prejudices. The envoy describes his attempts to understand the Gathenian mode. My efforts took the form of self-consciously seeing a Gathenian first as a man, then as a woman, forcing him into these categories so irrelevant to his nature and so essential to my own. The envoy is well aware that Gathenians are neither male nor female, and he also understands his own conditioned tendency to categorize them. This insight is impressive, and it makes his blunders all the more disappointing. Genli is clearly intelligent and tries to be open-minded, except for where his mind has already been closed. He refers to the people of Gethin almost exclusively using the masculine pronoun. In the first chapter, Genli writes, "The man, I must say, having said he and his." He defaults to the use of masculine pronouns without giving the issue any consideration. Then, he offers his previous use of this language as further reason to continue to describe Gathenians as men. Genli's logic is that the use of masculine language is self-justifying, which exposes his bias. Genli also has the misogyny to back up his androcentrism. This misogyny is frequently displayed in his gendering of Gathenians. Genli labels behaviors that he finds suspicious or disagreeable as feminine. He calls the politician Estrevin's evasions of his questions effeminate deviousness, and speculates, was it in fact perhaps this soft, supple femininity that I disliked and distrusted in him? Genli goes on to note that Estrevin's powerful presence made it impossible to see him as a woman, yet when he tries to think of Estrevin as a man, he feels a sense of falseness. Genli tries hard to place Estrevin as either male or female, yet he feels that neither option is correct. He ignores the option that he is intellectually aware of, but cannot culturally or emotionally comprehend, that Estrevin is neither a man nor a woman. Genli is quite biased against the feminine. This fact, along with his cultural programming to identify humans as belonging to either side of the sexual binary, prevents him from conceiving of a fully androgynous human. Thus, so long as his misogyny endures, Genli cannot accurately translate the Gathenian, let alone conceive of their gender. Even the most woke of feminists would have little more success in translation than Genli, however. Gathenian gender is impossible to translate into the written form because of its ephemeral nature. One can record every word of a conversation, yet this can never replace or truly replicate the experience of having the conversation itself. Ursula K. Le Guin's novel calls into question both the place and importance of gender in our society, but also the role of writing and orality in communication and in our daily lives.
Okay, we're gonna end on aliens and an existential crisis. While most critics treat Ted Chiang's deterministic universe as a negation of agency, I refine this to argue that Chiang relocates agency from authorship, or the act of creation, to readership, or the act of interpretation. Many scholars read Story of Your Life as a meditation on transcendence, or even an endorsement of it, but I'm much more interested in how both the text and Louise, the main character, failed to transcend, and how that failure was maybe the point all along. In failing to transcend, Chiang's story finds freedom in awareness itself. In my larger thesis, I showed that Chiang uses the alien heptapod language and its non-linear perception of time to question what it means to read, to listen, or to make meaning when the story is already written. By reimagining time as text itself, already composed yet still experienced moment by moment, Chiang transforms Louise from a mere character into both a reader and an author of her own life. Meaning then doesn't emerge from control over the future, but from the act of inhabiting it consciously.
Therefore, Chang doesn't just describe determinism, he performs it. Many readings of Story of Your Life stop at this observation that Chang's world is deterministic, but I argue further that the text is innately and meaningfully performative and enacts the experience of interpretive determinism onto the reader. Because of the nonlinear structure of the story, we know what will happen, and yet just like Louise, we keep reading. This proves that awareness of fate need not nullify meaning and that it can deepen it. To better understand the relationship between reading, writing, and freedom, I draw on Roland Barthes, whose essay, The Death of the Author, argues that once the text is written, it no longer belongs to the author. The meaning of the text is created by the reader's act of interpretation with all of the reader's own interpretive baggage attached. It is not fixed by the author's original intent. Barthes writes that a text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. Chang's use of second-person narration exemplifies this shift. It destabilizes the authorship and chronology and creates a narrative that speaks from within its own ending. By giving Louise both authorship as the narrator and readership as a character within a determined story, Chang makes interpretation itself an ethical act. I argue that he redefines freedom through interpretation, that meaning emerges not from authorship or invention, but from the act of reading one's life. This idea can be clearly seen in the salad bowl scene where Louise, while shopping, foresees her daughter's future accident with that same bowl. She reaches out and buys it anyway, saying it, quote, didn't feel like something I was forced to do. Instead, it seemed just as urgent as my rushing to catch the bowl when it falls on you, an instinct that I felt right in following, end quote. Through a Bartinian lens, this passage performs death of the author. Louise is no longer writing her life, but reading it, living it with an awareness within its already written script. Even though she doesn't have the option to make a different choice, she doesn't feel forced, rather it felt right. That feeling of rightness is her freedom. It's not about control, but about coherence and reading the story well. Her act of taking the bowl becomes a form of interpretive participation instead of a written command. Her act is not submission, but participation. She is both reader and character, both interpreting and being written, which shows how Story of Your Life reframes freedom as not the ability to alter the text, but again the ability to read it consciously. We don't need to change the narrative, but understand it differently each time it's read. If the bowl scene shows how Louise lives as a reader within her story, her narrative omissions reveal a different type of authorship, one that shapes how the story is told. She helps to prove that storytelling is not only about what is said, but about what is omitted. Louise recounts her love story with her husband Gary in a rich emotional detail, and yet she never discloses the reasons for their eventual divorce or the circumstances that led to them not speaking anymore. His second wife is referenced only throughout the novella as what's-her-face every time. These omissions are not carelessness, but interpretive agency and action. Just like a physicist canceling out non-optimal paths, Louise's narrative erases what does not fit her chosen coherence. This is not delusion, but discernment as she shapes her own understanding. What she omits becomes as meaningful as what she includes because absence itself becomes meaning. In this way, Chang dramatizes the tension between surrender and shaping that both exist within interpretation and freedom. For Chang, meaning lives in this tension. Once reading becomes freedom and interpretation becomes agency, language itself can emerge as the bridge between determinism and embodiment. In Chang's world, language itself is performative. It doesn't change reality, it reveals it. Knowing the script doesn't nullify agency, but transforms action into performance, deepening the meaning of every gesture. As Louise says, those who know the future don't talk about it. The silence that follows knowledge is not repression, but recognition, a quiet act of understanding through which performance becomes a form of affirmation. This idea culminates in the Goldilocks exchange she has with her daughter. Quote, that's not how the story goes. Well, if you already know how the story goes, why do you need me to read it to you? Because I want to hear it, end quote. Louise lives her life as one lives a rehearsed play. She knows every line, but she still has to say it in order for the story to be real. She even says this directly when conversing with the Colonel, quote, which could describe the sensation of conversing when you knew what would be said. It was like performing in a play, end quote. In this performative model, freedom is not the freedom to improvise, but the freedom to inhabit the script consciously. At this point, Chang's story has already grounded its philosophy in human experience like language, omission, and embodiment, but he extends this even further through his scientific metaphors. Chang translates determinism into human terms through the language of physics, specifically through the principle of least action. In physics, this principle states that any natural process, such as the movement of light, will always follow the most efficient path between 2 points. A photon, for instance, will appear to choose the route that minimizes the energy and time needed to make its journey. Scholars such as Barry Dayton and Chad Orzel both note in their critiques of the text that Chang uses this principle as a metaphor for consciousness and meaning. Orzel explains that technically speaking, light travels along every possible path between point A and every other point in space, point B, point C, and so on into infinity. When we observe it, however, we only see the single path from point A to point B that appears most efficient because that is what we are measuring. It's not that the light chose this path, it's that from our limited perspective, we can only perceive the outcome that makes the most sense within the system we can observe. Louise's life functions the exact same way. Her existence unfolds along infinite possible versions, but she only experiences one, the version that coheres into meaning when lived. Meaning, just like motion or light, does not arise from invention, but from selection, from what remains visible when all the other potential paths fall away. Chang transforms this physical law into a moral and interpretive one, showing that freedom is not the ability to alter the path, but the awareness to perceive it clearly, to understand why it takes the shape it does. If physics provides the metaphor, then Louise's narration provides its human echo. Dainton presents this as a metaphysical truth, but Chang renders it as a linguistic and epistemological experience. What does it mean to speak and interpret in a world where all meaning already exists? This four-dimensional universe functions like Barth's text in that it is complete and self-contained, but only meaningful when read and interacted with. In physics, reality only becomes real when it is observed. In Chang's text, life only becomes meaningful when interpreted. Interpretation is not additive, but selective, in the act of choosing which traces of ideas or of light paths to preserve and which to let fade is the truest form of freedom. Story of Your Life ultimately teaches us that life, just like language, is both written and read. A determined universe, if it existed, would not make life meaningless. It would make meaning possible in a completely new way. Freedom becomes not control, but awareness, and the ability to live deliberately within what is already written. To read the world as literature, to perform faithfully, to feel completely, and to call our futile attempts at understanding one another love.
It was wonderful with three really interesting papers, all of them involving various kinds of interesting failures to communicate in some ways. And so look forward to hearing what kind of questions you all have. So I'll open the floor. So,
Mine's for Mackenzie. So you talk about how Alfred resists through her memories, and so like I find it really interesting that she doesn't disclose her name within the novel. She just goes by Alfred, which kind of makes her, or correlates her with the commander. So my question is, how do you think, why do you think she chooses to be off-read instead of disclosing her name as a form of resistance?
Really good question. I think that she, keeps her name to herself because she isn't living as, well, people say that her name is June, but she isn't living as June, so I think that's kind of why she chooses to keep it private, and also kind of serves as one moment of control that she can have in a society that took away all of her control. So I think it's almost like a moment of reclaiming a little bit of power by keeping her name secret when everything else is meant to be so public for her.
My question is for Freeman. In the novel, you talk about how the main character is a human and really has trouble comprehending the alien species and their expression of gender. But how do you think those messages translate into the human society and our spectrums of gender and how we communicate?
I think this novel was written in 1969 for context. So that's really just before the start of the big queer movements in America. And I think if it was written even 10 years later, it might be very different. So I think we're definitely getting the straight white dude in the 60s in America perspective with Genli. And I think if it was somebody a little less dated or woker or something like that, it could definitely be translated in some way, but I think because Gathenian gender isn't really present in the novel. Like, it's kind of something that I feel like is, you have to like extrapolate to understand, like, because the only assignments of gender that are made by Genli. So, like, even when you have Gathenian speakers, whether it's a story or Estraven's journal, there's not really any gendering happening. So I think, to get back to your question, it definitely would be very different if it was written later and we could see maybe some kind of translation, but I still think that Gathenian gender is sort of unreachable.
Kind of building off that, Freeman, you had mentioned like Estraven's journals and also like the other Gathenian like stories. How does the fact that like we as readers are reading these translated stories in this book, how does that really tie into your sense of like oral versus written communication?
That's something that I kind of lamented as I'm working on my thesis. It's because we have all these like Gathenian oral stories that we can assume are recorded and translated by Genli. And I wonder like what we are missing out on when it's filtered through his lens. And so I think, you know, these stories, when you put them all together and you have, you know, one story that's like a creation tale and one story that's about some king who was murdered and all these different things, like you can sort of start to get a sense of the culture, but when you just have Genli's perspective, you just have a single story, it's really hard to recover something from all of those.
Ultimately, this question is for Piper, but before that, I just wanted to think for a minute about how both Mackenzie and Freeman are describing narrators whose, as Professor Garcia called attention to, whose failures end up asking us to, like, sort of, they end up gesturing toward something more meaningful that you're like lamenting that we don't have access to. And in Mackenzie, your version of like not sharing her name, I thought that was really beautiful, like that it lets us think about her as having privacy and like a fuller identity that she isn't able to articulate in this constrained moment. But then, Piper, when you said at the beginning, most folks who write about Ted Chiang's story of your life, say that it is like about transcendence, and you were talking about like the failure of transcendence at the beginning. And so I wondered, like, could you talk just a little bit about that, like the failure part of the transcendence? I mean, I think I'm getting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
so you're like actually asking it what like a lot of my larger thesis is on that I unfortunately didn't have the time to touch on everything here, but so yeah, like I said at the beginning, a lot of people when they're reading this work think about it as like with enlightenment kind of as the goal of like because Louise doesn't ever fully access that heptapod mode of viewing reality. She's able to like to see everything at once and see her entire life at once, but she's not able to experience all of these events at once the way the heptapods do. She describes like these flashes where sometimes she has like an instance of like how the heptapods really experience the world, but she'll never fully get there, and so that is kind of like the failure. And I think a lot of people assume when they start reading that enlightenment is the goal, that the goal would be to get to the heptapod mode of awareness. But kind of like why I'm so interested in the physics is because I think that I don't necessarily agree with that idea. I think that there are benefits to both, but the fact that she isn't able to get there is just because she's limited by her human body. And so like physically, like it's just not possible for her to get there. But look, I think one of the really good examples would be like Orzel, the scholar that I quoted a bit and like talked about a little bit. He is very unhappy with the way that Ted Chiang uses physics in the novel or in the novella, because
he says, I mean, kind of how I said, like, light doesn't actually, like, look at all the possible paths and then choose one. It takes every path. And then, so I think, like, the heptapods, if their, like, way of viewing the world is affecting, like, the way that they perceive things and the way they interpret things, then, like, in that situation, that's not technically, like, the quote-unquote right way of looking at it, or, like, that's not even what's necessarily happening, but because they see everything all at once, the way that the light does, they interpret it. So, like, just in the same way that humans might assign cause and effect to things that don't necessarily, like, that doesn't necessarily apply to because of our limited perception, I think the heptapods are also limited in ways it's harder to see because they're limited in very different ways and have access to a lot of things we don't have access to. So I think it's not super intuitive to think about that originally as, like, a limit. But yeah, I think the fact that she fails to transcend, one, points to Chang's ideas about embodiment as, like, kind of the basis of that limit, but also that, like, again, like I said, like, that's kind of the whole point, is she gets, like, this unique experience. She understands that, like, they're neither of them are right, the human way or the heptapod way. So yeah, hopefully somewhere in there I was able to answer your question.
My question is for Mackenzie. In answering Savannah's question, I thought of something interesting. You mentioned, like, public and private, and that's, like, the big focus of my thesis, and, like, I talked about today, like, space. And you mentioned, like, how your character kind of reclaims some privacy with, like, the name thing, like how every privacy is kind of stripped of these characters. And I was wondering, like, if there's any other places in the novel where we see characters, like, reclaiming privacy, or even if there's, like, physical spaces where they, like, reclaim privacy, or any of that sort of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't really, most of the other characters they're not really as talked about as much, but I think Offred, reclaims a little bit of privacy, specifically through her memory, because those aren't things that other people are understanding, and they're very personable to her, and she goes into a lot of details about life when she had a daughter, and she had a husband, and her mother, and I think that's a little bit of space where she's keeping some sort of privacy, but given the fact that she's telling a tale that's meant to be heard by others, that overall, I feel like I could argue that she doesn't really hold any privacy, I guess, in that way, because she is sharing it out, but she's doing so at her own will. So I guess that's where her little bit of privacy comes in, because she's choosing what memories others will eventually hear, hopefully.
She's recording it, right?
Yes.
So that it's being.
Yeah, she, like, records it on a tape because she's not. One of the rules of Gilead is that you can't read or write or anything. So that's, like, a little bit of a little secrecy in that.
Something like a space.
Yeah.
So, Harry, do you have a question?
Yeah. I had a question for Piper. It's kind of a simple question, but I would just like to hear your answer. Do you think Louise is at a disadvantage or an advantage compared to other people because she's already seen her life before she's lived it? Do you think that's something that puts her at an advantage or a disadvantage? I kind of have two answers to this question, not to, like, be a politician about it, but I kind of think it go both ways. On one hand, I would say she does definitely have the advantage just because she's given access to, like, this like completely unique, both from the heptapods and from the humans, way of viewing reality. And I will say, like, I don't think, like, it's easy to think of that as really difficult, of, like, obviously she has this daughter who is going to die really young, and she knows that and chooses to conceive of this daughter anyway. And I think something that I found really interesting that I think proves that, like, it is kind of an advantage to her is that there are other linguists that are working on the translations between human language and heptapod language. I think she says there's about 13 other linguists, like, around the world that are doing the same thing she does. And she specifically says that she knows some of them have, like, learned heptapod B to the proficiency that she has, so they're experiencing the same thing. And yet she never chooses to, like, talk to any of them. None of them ever reach out to each other. They all just exist in their own world with this new unique perception, so we really don't get any idea. So in that way, I would say, like, it is advantageous because she gets that completely new perspective, and like, she is obviously okay enough on her own that she doesn't need to, like, be going to talk to the other people that have necessarily had this experience, or she doesn't, like, freak out or things like that. And at the same time, I think, like, almost like on a spiritual level, like, you could argue that, like, the point of being human is to experience things through that human perception. And so like with her human life here, was that maybe intended for her to only experience things through the human life, and then in her next life, then she'll be a heptapod and learn those lessons. So I think if you take like a more, like if you step back a little bit, then I would say maybe she's not going 100% towards the plan, but overall I would say it is an advantage for her.
One last question, perhaps, Ben?
I've got a question for Piper. I thought that's really cool to take this question of determinism and not take it to a sort of philosophical, like Calvinist place, but instead go to linguistics. And I was wondering how you settled on post-structuralist theory to sort of explain that, to consider it.
Yeah, so I originally actually read this short story in Professor Garcia's class about 2 years ago, so shout out to him for introducing me to it. I think I was like initially just really pulled by the story. I'm, as Professor Garcia said, a bit of a nerd about linguistics in general, and so like I think the amount of work that Chang did researching both physics and linguistics, like for years and years, he spent researching both of those topics to put them into this this short story, and I think that to me was immediately visible and kind of one of the things that like really pulled me in, just like in the beginning where I was like, how did someone even think to like get this detailed about all these different parts of linguistics of this completely made up language, and how do all of these things kind of come together? And I think like one of the hard parts as I've been like over the last 9 months or so trying to produce this larger thesis is finding something that like nobody else has said yet. Like I kind of went through it in like the thesis in a little bit when I answered Professor Kiesel's question of like a lot of people, I kind of like, I realized the two camps people were split in, and I felt drawn to like one of them or both of them, and I wasn't really sure like how I wanted to make my own intervention. But I think just personally, I'm really drawn to like concepts of free will and determinism, and I don't know if we have free will, but I like to think that we still have freedom. And so I don't know if we live in a determined universe, but like personally speaking, like my thesis was sort of supposed to be like, okay, well even if we do, we still have freedom. So like it's okay. So I think like a lot of it came just from like personal interests and stuff, and like trying to find something that hadn't necessarily already been said yet.
That's very compelling, so thank you.
So excellent. One round of applause for I think really need to recognize Professor Brennan, who's done just a wonderful job with this group of just extraordinary scholars and work. So a big round of applause. Thank you all for really 2 great nights. You know, it's just extraordinary, wonderful to see the connections within panels, between panels, and all of that. And so for all of us who didn't have to get up here, let's give them one more time. Now, go away.
Look at it from this way because I drew it that way at the flat angle. And I want to read that. Let's see over there. It's over. Oh yeah.
I know. I felt like well done, Shannon. Congratulations. What a great group.